The Gulf chessboard just shifted. Iran's surprise attack, Trump's response, and the coalition nobody expected. Hello everyone, welcome back. This is YAMINOSCAR. First of all, I want to sincerely thank everyone who has subscribed, supported the channel, and continues to watch and listen to our analysis. We are doing our best to bring you research, context, and geopolitical analysis that can help us understand what is happening behind the headlines. And of course, you may have a different opinion. You may see these events from another perspective, and that's completely fine, because the purpose of this channel is not to tell you what to think. It is to give us another angle, another layer of analysis, and hopefully another piece of knowledge that can help all of us understand this complicated world. So today, let's take a serious look at a dramatic shift taking place across the Middle East. Because what happened over the last few days may be much bigger than a single missile attack. We are watching the possible formation of a new security alignment in the Gulf, an alignment that may not have a formal name. It may not have a treaty. It may not even be a traditional military alliance. But when the same countries begin sharing intelligence, intercepting attacks, coordinating military operations, and responding to the same threat, something is changing. And that brings us to the central question of today's analysis. Did Iran's strategy of pressure accidentally create the very coalition it was trying to avoid? Let's break it down. The surprise attack in Jordan. The first piece of the puzzle is Jordan. According to U.S. officials, Iran launched a ballistic missile attack aimed at American forces in the region, including U.S. personnel in Jordan. The attack was described by U.S. Central Command as an attempted surprise attack, and according to the U.S. military, the missiles were intercepted. Cite Turn News 6, Turn News 8 slide. Now, this is already significant. Ballistic missiles are not ordinary weapons. They travel extremely fast. That means defenders may have only a limited amount of time to detect, identify, track, and intercept an incoming projectile. And when you're defending military personnel, air bases, infrastructure, and potentially civilian areas, every second matters. But the most interesting question is not simply, did the missiles get intercepted? The more important question is, why launch the attack at this particular moment? Because the timing matters. The United States and Iran had already experienced an intense period of confrontation. And then came a temporary pause. There were diplomatic efforts. There were discussions about the Strait of Hormuz. There were questions about Iran's nuclear ambitions. There were efforts to determine whether the conflict could be brought back toward negotiations. And then suddenly, missiles. That creates a very complicated strategic picture. Diplomacy on one side, missiles on the other. This is where geopolitics becomes incredibly difficult to understand. Because diplomacy and military pressure are not always opposites. Sometimes they operate simultaneously. One side can be talking about negotiations while preparing military options. One side can be offering a ceasefire while trying to improve its position on the battlefield. And one side can be threatening retaliation while still keeping diplomatic channels open. That may sound contradictory, but in international politics, it is often the entire strategy. The message can essentially be, we are willing to negotiate, but we are also willing to escalate. And both messages are designed to influence the other side. Iran wants leverage. Washington wants leverage. Israel wants leverage. The Gulf states want security. And everybody wants to avoid being the weakest player at the negotiating table. So when missiles fly during a period of diplomacy, we shouldn't immediately assume that diplomacy has completely failed. Sometimes the opposite is true. Military escalation can be used to strengthen the negotiating position. And that may be one of the most important lessons from this crisis. The Strait of Hormuz changes everything. Now let's talk about the Strait of Hormuz. This is where the entire crisis becomes much bigger than Iran and the United States. Hormuz is one of the most strategically important maritime choke points on Earth. A huge amount of global energy trade passes through this narrow waterway. That means the strait isn't merely a geographic location. It is economic leverage. If shipping becomes dangerous, insurance costs rise. If vessels are delayed, transportation costs increase. If energy shipments are disrupted, oil prices can react. And if the disruption becomes prolonged, countries far away from the Middle East can feel the consequences. That means a conflict involving Iran can quickly become a global economic problem. A factory in Asia, a refinery in Europe, a truck driver in America, a consumer paying for gasoline. None of them need to know where Hormuz is on a map to feel the consequences. That's the power of a choke point. And this is precisely why Washington, Tehran, Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, and other regional capitals are watching the Strait so closely. Iran's strategic dilemma. Iran has a difficult problem. It wants to demonstrate that it cannot simply be pushed around. It wants to preserve its regional influence. It wants to protect its nuclear leverage. It wants the United States to pay a price for military pressure. But there is a limit. Because the more aggressively Iran attacks countries across the region, the more likely those countries are to conclude that neutrality is no longer enough. And that may be the unintended consequence of the current strategy. Iran may be trying to increase the cost of American military involvement, but if its attacks also increase the cost for Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Kuwait, Bahrain, the UAE, or other regional states, those governments have a very strong reason to cooperate more closely with Washington, and that is where the strategic equation begins to change. The coalition that doesn't have a name. Let's call it an informal coalition, not because there is necessarily a formal treaty creating one. There isn't, but because countries that once had different priorities can suddenly find themselves facing the same security problem. Saudi Arabia wants to protect its territory and energy infrastructure. Jordan wants to prevent attacks from crossing its airspace and threatening its security. The United States wants to protect its forces and prevent Iran from expanding the conflict. Israel wants to reduce Iran's military and strategic capabilities, and the Gulf states want to keep their ports, energy facilities, airports, and cities functioning. These interests are not identical, but they overlap. And in geopolitics, overlapping interests can be enough. Saudi Arabia has publicly come to attacks attributed to Iran-backed groups and warned that it reserves the right to respond. The Gulf Cooperation Council and Jordan have also issued a joint condemnation of Iranian attacks and emphasized their right to self-defense. Site turn search 32. That response is becoming more coordinated, and coordination creates power. Saudi Arabia enters the equation. Now we come to Saudi Arabia. For years, Riyadh has tried to balance its relationship with Washington while managing its own regional interests. Saudi Arabia does not necessarily want a total war with Iran. In fact, Riyadh has every reason to avoid one. A regional war threatens oil infrastructure. It threatens shipping. It threatens investment. It threatens tourism. It threatens economic transformation. Saudi Arabia has major economic ambitions beyond oil. And none of those ambitions benefit from another prolonged regional war. But here's the problem. You can choose neutrality. You cannot always choose whether the war reaches you. If drones begin targeting your territory, if energy infrastructure is threatened, if missiles or proxy attacks cross your borders, then neutrality becomes increasingly difficult. That is exactly why recent developments are so important. Saudi Arabia and the United States conducted strikes against Iran-aligned militias in Iraq after attacks targeting U.S. forces and Saudi energy infrastructure, according to U.S. military and other reporting. Site turn News 6 turn News 11. And Saudi Arabia is no longer simply watching the conflict, it is becoming part of the security response. Iraq becomes the middle ground. And now we reach Iraq. This is perhaps one of the most dangerous pieces on the chessboard. Iraq is caught between competing forces. On one side, it has a sovereign government that does not necessarily want its territory used as a launch pad for attacks against neighboring countries. On the other side, there are powerful armed groups with long-standing ties to Iran. That creates a fundamental problem. If an Iran-aligned militia launches a drone from Iraqi territory, Saudi Arabia sees an attack coming from Iraq. Washington sees a threat connected to Iran. Baghdad sees its sovereignty being challenged, and Tehran can potentially maintain some degree of distance from the attack. That is the strategic advantage of proxy warfare. But it also creates a dangerous problem, because proxies can trigger consequences that their sponsors may not fully control. One drone attack can create a retaliation. The retaliation creates another attack. That creates another response. And suddenly the original actors are no longer controlling the escalation ladder. This is how regional wars expand, not necessarily because one government wakes up and says, let's start a regional war. Sometimes it happens because every side responds to the previous side. One step, then another, until everyone realizes the situation has gone much further than anyone originally intended. Why the US-Saudi strikes matter. This is why the US-Saudi strikes in Iraq matter beyond the immediate military targets. The message is bigger than the bombs. The message is, attacks on American forces and Gulf infrastructure can produce a coordinated response. That changes deterrence. Iran and its aligned groups now have to consider not only what the United States might do, but what Saudi Arabia and other regional states might do. And this is where the informal coalition becomes strategically important. The coalition doesn't need to have a flag. It doesn't need a headquarters. It doesn't need a name. It simply needs a shared understanding. If one of us is attacked, the cost may be imposed collectively. That can be a powerful deterrent, but it can also be dangerous, because deterrence only works if both sides believe the other side is willing to escalate. And when both sides believe that, you get a very nervous region. Israel and the Trump factor. Now add Israel to the equation. Donald Trump has repeatedly emphasized his relationship with Benjamin Netanyahu and the importance of American-Israeli strategic coordination. For Iran, that is a major concern, because if Iran faces the United States alone, the strategic equation is one thing. If Iran faces the United States while also confronting Israel, while dealing with pressure from Gulf states, while facing hostile regional proxies, and while trying to protect its critical infrastructure, the equation becomes much more complicated. But here's where we need to be careful. We should not automatically describe this as a fully unified military alliance. The interests of Israel, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Jordan, and the United States are not identical. They have different priorities, they have different relationships with Iran, and they may disagree about how far military escalation should go. That's why I call this an informal coalition, not a formal alliance. The cooperation is real, but the political limits are real too. Trump's biggest problem: how far is too far? And this brings us to Donald Trump. Trump faces a very difficult strategic choice. He wants to demonstrate strength. He wants Iran to understand that attacks on American forces will have consequences. But he also has an interest in avoiding an endless war. And that creates a contradiction. If Trump responds too weakly, Iran may interpret that as weakness. If Trump responds too aggressively, Iran may retaliate, and then the United States retaliates again, and then Iran responds again. And suddenly we're back inside the same cycle. That's the trap. Trump has to maintain deterrence without creating an uncontrollable escalation spiral. And that is much easier said than done. The nuclear question. Now let's talk about the issue sitting behind almost everything else: Iran's nuclear program. This is perhaps the most important long-term issue in the entire confrontation, because the nuclear question is not simply about one weapon. It is about leverage. For Iran, nuclear capability can provide strategic insurance. For Israel, a potentially nuclear-capable Iran is viewed as an existential security concern. For Washington, preventing nuclear proliferation is a major strategic objective. And for the Gulf states, the possibility of a nuclear arms race in the region is deeply concerning. If diplomacy fails, the nuclear question doesn't disappear. It becomes more dangerous. And this is why the United States has to think beyond the next missile attack. The objective cannot simply be punish Iran. The strategic objective has to be, what political outcome do we want after the military pressure ends? That is the question governments often fail to answer. Winning a bombing campaign is one thing. Creating a stable political order after is something completely different. The biggest mistake would be to underestimate Iran. And this is where we should avoid another simplistic narrative. Iran is under pressure, but pressure does not mean helplessness. Iran still has geographic depth. It has missile capabilities, it has drones, it has asymmetric warfare capabilities, it has regional networks, it has experience operating under sanctions, and it has spent decades developing strategies designed specifically to survive pressure from stronger conventional military powers. That means Tehran still has options. It can use direct military action, It can rely on aligned groups. It can create pressure around shipping. It can exploit political divisions among its opponents, and it can use diplomacy to try to divide the coalition facing it. This is why the next phase may not simply be America attacks, Iran responds, America attacks again. It could be much more complicated. Iran may attempt to weaken the coalition politically instead of attacking it militarily, and that may be the smarter strategy. The real target may be the coalition itself. Think about this. If Iran cannot defeat the United States militarily, perhaps it can create disagreements between Washington and Riyadh. If it cannot confront Israel directly, perhaps it can create pressure on Arab governments that don't want to be seen as supporting Israeli military operations. If it cannot stop American forces, perhaps it can make the cost of hosting those forces politically unacceptable. This is classic strategic competition. You don't always defeat an opponent by destroying his army. Sometimes you weaken the political relationship holding the alliance together. And this could become one of the biggest battles of the next phase. Not missiles, not drones, not fighter jets. Political cohesion. The Gulf states have a very different objective. This is something we should not forget. Saudi Arabia does not necessarily want to become America's permanent frontline against Iran. The UAE does not necessarily want to become a battlefield. Jordan does not want to become a launch pad for regional war. Kuwait does not want its territory turned into a military target. These countries want security. They want economic stability. They want trade. They want investment. And they want energy markets to remain predictable. So if Washington wants these governments to cooperate, it has to convince them that American military power will make them safer, not simply make them more visible targets. That is the central political challenge. Hormuz is the red line everyone is watching. And then there is Hormuz. This may ultimately become the most dangerous pressure point, because Iran understands that it cannot necessarily defeat the United States in conventional warfare. But it may be able to threaten the global economy through the maritime environment. Even the perception of danger can be powerful. Shipping companies can reroute. Insurance premiums can rise. Energy traders can react. Markets can become nervous. And governments can begin pressuring Washington to reduce the military confrontation. That creates an indirect weapon. Instead of attacking America directly, you create economic pressure on America's allies. And eventually, those allies may begin asking Washington, how long is this going to continue? That's the strategic logic, and it is precisely why Hormuz is so important. The dangerous possibility, a war that nobody wants. Now imagine the worst-case scenario. A missile is launched, an interceptor fails, American personnel are killed, Washington responds, Iran responds. A proxy group attacks a Gulf energy facility. Saudi Arabia responds. Israel launches another operation. Iran retaliates. Shipping is disrupted in Hormuz. Oil prices rise. Global markets panic. And suddenly, the original political objective has disappeared. Nobody is talking about nuclear negotiations anymore. Nobody is talking about diplomacy. Everyone is talking about retaliation. That is how a regional war can become self-sustaining. And that's why every actor in the region has to think carefully. Because once escalation becomes the dominant political language, backing down becomes difficult. A leader who wants to de-escalate can be accused of weakness. A government that wants negotiations can be accused of surrender. And every new attack creates political pressure for another response. This is how wars become longer than their architects intended. So what is the real strategy? Let's step back. What are the major players actually trying to accomplish? The United States wants deterrence, leverage, and control over the escalation. Israel wants to reduce the Iranian military and nuclear threat. Saudi Arabia wants security and protection of its infrastructure. Jordan wants its territory protected. The Gulf states want their economies and shipping routes protected. Iran wants to survive, preserve its strategic leverage, and prevent its regional influence from being destroyed. And Iraq wants to avoid becoming the battlefield where all of these competing interests collide. These objectives overlap in some places and completely contradict each other in others. That is why this chessboard is so complicated. The biggest question, who blinks first? And now we come to the question that matters most. Who blinks first? Does Iran decide that the cost of continuing attacks is too high? Does Trump decide that additional escalation is too risky? Do Gulf states push for stronger American action? Does Israel push Washington to maintain maximum pressure? Or does diplomacy eventually create a pathway that allows all sides to claim victory? Because that's what diplomacy often requires, not one side surrendering, but every side being able to tell its own population, we won something. Iran might say it defended its sovereignty. Trump might say he forced Iran to negotiate. Israel might say Iran's military capability was weakened. Saudi Arabia might say its territory is now safer. And the Gulf states might say they prevented a wider war. That is what a diplomatic exit could look like. Nobody gets everything, but nobody has to admit complete defeat. Final analysis. So friends, what are we really witnessing? This is not simply Trump versus Iran. It is not simply Israel versus Iran. And it is not simply America versus the Islamic Republic. We are watching a much larger competition over deterrence, energy, nuclear capability, regional influence, and political survival. The missile attack in Jordan matters because it demonstrates how quickly the battlefield can move across borders. The US-Saudi strikes in Iraq matter because they show that attacks by Iran-aligned groups can trigger coordinated responses. The reaction from Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states matters because regional governments increasingly see their own territory and infrastructure as part of the conflict. And the Strait of Hormuz matters because the entire global economy is watching. But perhaps the most important lesson is this: the strongest weapon may not be the missile. It may be the coalition. If Iran can divide the United States, Israel, and the Gulf states, Tehran gains room to maneuver. If Washington can keep those countries coordinated, Iran faces a much more difficult strategic environment. That is the real chess match. Not simply who has more missiles, but who can maintain political unity under pressure. And this is why I would be very careful with predictions that Iran is already defeated, or that a larger regional war is inevitable. Neither conclusion is justified yet. The situation is far too fluid. Iran still has options. The United States still has enormous military power. Israel still has major capabilities. Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states have significant economic and strategic leverage. And diplomacy is still possible. But diplomacy becomes harder every time another missile is launched, every time another drone hits infrastructure, every time another soldier is killed, every time another government feels forced to respond. The danger is not necessarily that one side wakes up tomorrow and decides, let's start World War III. The danger is much more ordinary. One retaliation creates another, another creates another, and eventually, the escalation becomes the strategy. That is what everyone should be watching. So the real question isn't simply, will Iran surrender its nuclear ambitions? The deeper question is, can the United States and its partners create enough pressure to force Tehran back to diplomacy without pushing the entire region into a war that nobody can control? Because there is a very narrow line between deterrence and escalation. Too little pressure, and your opponent may believe aggression is cheap. Too much pressure, and your opponent may decide that there is nothing left to lose. And somewhere between those two extremes is the diplomatic space that could determine what happens next. The Gulf chessboard has shifted. The pieces are moving. Washington is watching Tehran. Tehran is watching Washington. Israel is watching Iran. Saudi Arabia is watching its borders and energy infrastructure. Iraq is trying to keep its territory from becoming a battlefield. And the entire world is watching the Strait of Hormuz. So don't just watch the missiles. Watch the alliances. Watch the diplomacy. Watch the oil markets. Watch Iraq. Watch Saudi Arabia, and most importantly, watch whether this emerging coalition stays together. Because if it does, Iran may find itself facing a strategic environment far more difficult than it expected. But if that coalition begins to fracture, Tehran may find the space it needs to survive. And that is why the next move could be the most important one yet. Thank you for watching. I'm YAMINOSCAR. And as always, remember, we are not here simply to repeat the headlines. We are here to understand what may be happening behind them. Stay curious, keep questioning, and never stop learning. I'll see you in the next analysis.